parenting, a controversial topic because everybody has their own opinions. As we discussed in the last show, most of us use our own parents as an example, and the results of that, of us being okay, turning out okay, as kind of the metric. The Dr. Patino, again, welcome again. Thank you for being here. What if there is a standard metric that someone could use to actually determine whether they've been an effective parent or not?
Well, it's it's interesting. It's like, and I was talking to a patient earlier today, and we were talking about normalcy. We're talking about what is normal personality, and I'm not going to get too much in a tangent, but it basically means all of the abnormalcies in good balance, right? So when you look at normal parenting, is that you have to get a little bit of all the bad in little doses, right? It's not the up. This is a very difficult to measure the other way around, like to measure the goodness, right? In terms of, but you have to be able to say, my kid is balanced. My kid goes to school, has friends, fights with them once in a while, gets frustrated, you know. So everything that you have an expectation of that is coming to you in low doses and that you're able to manage it properly, right? So you don't really know if you have done an average balanced parenting job till your kids grow up, right? Until they become adults, and then you look at the degree of adaptiveness. And even that, the adaptiveness as adults becomes more of an issue of how they utilize their skills, how do they take risks, how do they react to rejection and criticism, how do they handle other authority figures, right? But at the end, I don't think that we should be asking the question, have I done a good job? And the reason I don't think we should be asking the question is because it's not about us. It's about them, right? And we cannot expect our kids to come back and tell us that we did a good job, right? Because at the end of the day, the tools that we're giving them are for them to utilize, not for us to be proud of, right? Now, it feels good to see your kids having success. It feels good to have your kids have their own families. It feels good to have your kids and grandkids grow up to be content, right? It feels good. That's a reward. It feels good. It's not the narcissistic reward of I'm the greatest parent in the world because my kids are successful, right? Because something that we have to remember is that our relationship with our kids as they become older changes, but there's still a relationship. And we're going to continue to mature that relationship, right? And your kids will continue to learn and you will continue to learn. So to some degree, raising kids is a two-way street, right? You're raising your kids and you're maturing yourself. And we hope that the process of raising your kids is a maturing experience for the parents.
Now, would you say that some of these helicopter parents or the overly protective parents or the ones that refuse to let their kids have experience any unsettling experiences or pain, is that an example of someone not learning from that two-way street? Or is that a different pathology?
Well, I wouldn't call it pathology necessarily. You call them that. I don't think it's pathological. I think it's intense.
Okay.
I think it leads to some dysfunction, right? And it reflects a lot of fear and insecurity. So it becomes a vicious cycle of fear, overprotectiveness, overprotectiveness, more fear, right? And then once in a while, you get into the self-fulfilling prophecy that something does go wrong, right? And then you start utilizing the going wrong as a way of proving the point that you must be overprotective.
Oh.
The problem is that overprotectiveness is not necessarily good for the kids. It may make the parents feel safe. So the motivation of overprotectiveness needs to be reevaluated, right? So why are we being overprotective? Well, we want the kids to be safe, but are the kids learning something from it, right? And I'm not saying stop being protective, because we get into, especially in this country, we get into these dichotomies, all or nothing, nothing in between. We feel terribly uncomfortable with the uncertainty of the middle, right? So we really have, as parents, we have to experience the uncertainty of the middle together with our kids because it's good for them, not because it's good for us, right? So sometimes, and we're talking about kids that don't have any issues, but when you start getting into kids that have neurodevelopmental issues or attention issues or anxiety issues, then you perpetuate the process, right? And one of the, and it's going to sound kind of paradoxical, but one of the most significant problems when we're dealing with um, parenting is that excessive intelligence may not necessarily be the best experience for the kid because we want kids to be logical all the time. And life is not logical all the time. Uncertainty is not logical all the time, right? So we have to learn the kids to be mature intellectually and mature emotionally. And the problem with over intellectualizing parenting is that we get kids that are extremely mature intellectually, but very immature emotionally. So you get this problem now that the kid has great conversations with you logically, and when things don't go their way, they throw you these huge tantrums, right? And that's very confusing for parents because they feel that the kid is at a higher level because they're intellectual when they're really not emotionally. Now, I use describe adolescence for you, by the way.
Yeah. And how does one balance that out when you do have a kid with a higher IQ, maybe a more academic inclination? Of course, not neurally typical, but just a crazy smart kid. How do you balance that out? What's the best way for a parent to approach that?
Well, you see, the best way for you to teach your kids to grow emotionally is by do what we call calculated frustration and experience, right? So overprotecting the kids from experience teaches them a lot of intellectual stuff, but no experience because you cannot grow emotionally without experience, right? And I'm not talking about the experience of being in a team, right? Or being in karate or the experience that comes from uncertainty, risk taking, okay, and not getting hurt too much, right? So that gives you more emotional maturity. Now, we can argue that there are kids that are very emotionally mature and very intellectually immature, right? We see that a lot in certain kids. Uh, I see it a lot in kids with substance abuse problems, right? That they feel superior because emotionally they have taken a lot of risks, right? And they feel that they have experienced more than most kids. In the old days, we used to call that junkie pride,
Hmm.
right? You better remember that word. So the problem is that these kids that are into the substance abuse sphere, who have been under intellectualized and over emotionalized, whether it's from abuse, neglect, whatever it is, attention deficit disorder, not fear of risk taking, anything like that. These kids, their intellectualizations are very poor. Their problem solving is very poor, even though they have had a lot of experience. So neither extreme is good, right? We do have to have some balance, right? Between emotional maturity and intellectual maturity. Now, nature itself makes adolescents a little more mature intellectually than emotionally. And that is by, I don't know, biological design, if you may, because there's a purpose behind adolescence, and the purpose is separation. And it's difficult for people to separate emotionally. So they separate intellectually. They basically tell you that you don't know anything and they know everything, right? And that nothing bad's going to happen to them, right?
A very typical refrain for most teenagers.
Yes. So some degree of that has to be an acceptable average behavior.
Mhm.
So how do we know when it's not? Too much, too often, and too destructive. So keeping those things in mind become important, right? And again, we're talking about the average teenager, right? I mean, anybody who's had teenagers have learned to not like their kids. Still love them a lot, and we always say you don't have to like the people you love. We have to remember that.
So if a child has some neglect or abuse and they tend to be um, intellectually more developed, they will tend to suffer then on the emotional level. On the other side of that, you have people who are emotionally mature but have intellect, not necessarily disability, but lack of development there. They will tend to suffer on that other end. Is that correct?
Correct. To see what happens is, uh, let's go to the kids who over experience, and they feel that they're emotionally more mature but intellectually concrete, right? So what happens with those kids? The kids is that when they're not able to get what they want because they feel entitled to it, then they become aggressive. They
Mm.
become arrogant. They become demanding because their position is, you don't know anything about my world, so how can you tell me, anything about anything, right? So we're starting to get a little bit into the pathological side, because and we have, when it comes to the neglect side, there's a lot of research actually on the kids of alcoholic parents, right? Growing up in an alcoholic environment, and how many of those kids become uh, very smart, very successful, but very empty. Because underneath, there's a lot of insecurity of uh, people finding out the your shame, right? Meaning that you come from an alcoholic family. So it's in a very roundabout way. When you talk about the alcoholic child, which is a fascinating process, the child becomes not unusually successful but empty, right? Very intellectual, but you have probably have heard that there's a lot of overprotection of the alcoholic in the alcoholic family, because you want to make sure that for the rest of the world the family looks normal, right? So you grow up with this doubt that there's something wrong with you as part of that family, and in some kids feeling that they're responsible for the parents' inadequacies, right?
Think actually really thinking they have some blame for it. Is that correct?
Absolutely, that's not unusual. Very seldom kids will blame their parents for their dysfunction. So self-esteem requires a high degree of empathy, and it requires a high degree of recognition and control frustration, right? That we let the kids know what they're good for and what they're not good for, right? And that both sides are okay. So that will be more of a balance.
So if a parent is aware of their own shortcomings in that way, how do they manage it when interacting with their child so it doesn't negatively affect them?
When you're a parent, the best approach you can have is what we call empathic assertiveness, right? Meaning that you understand your kids and you want the best for them, and you understand their happiness and their pain, okay? But you also understand that it's theirs, and that is your job to set the parameters for them to experience life, okay? With you to some degree being the judge of providing measured empathy and recognition with measured frustration. And it's actually a balance of those two, right? That the kid grows up with a balanced perception of themselves. Okay. We very often we want to make sure our kids are proud of us as parents. We want our kids to like us. We want our kids to admire us as parents, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Is how much. And how much our need for recognition, admiration, respect, whatever you want to call it, becomes the primary purpose of our raising our kids. And again, you get into extremes, right? And, and I mean, you can get into being raised by a narcissistic father or narcissistic mother, right? There are complications with that, because the kid ends up looking at you as a mirror. And if you fail, they fail, right? So there's no recognition of this over recognition of achievement and under recognition of failure, right? So failure becomes something to be afraid of, and you can't live your life being afraid of failure.
Absolutely. Most of our best lessons come from that instead of the other way around. As a coach, I've experienced that, and then working with some of the military personnel I have, they build failure into their training processes so that people are not afraid of it, and that they're always looking at it as a learning experience. But it doesn't stop them from trying unique and new things, especially in that environment.
Let me give you an example of how well-intentioned parents sometimes, um, in a very colloquial, casual way, say the wrong things, right? And I'm going to call it the wrong thing because it's not really the wrong thing, but it's a thing that you're saying that the kid's listening to, and is the kid's interjecting, is bringing insight. Let's say I'm seeing a kid who is, I don't know, 10 years old, right? And the kid has attention deficit disorder. And the kid has not getting any treatment and he's failing in school. Um, and the parent during the conversation and the kid's present, right, keeps saying, uh, we took him to the pediatrician to see what's wrong with him. Then we took him to a therapist to see what's wrong with him. Um, and at a certain point, I had to stop and say, listen, I think it'd be better if you change the word what's wrong with him to what the problem is, right? And then we're going to change that once we find out what the problem is to a problem he has, not the problem he is.
Mm.
So we have to, and again, we have to learn to listen to what we're saying, because everything we say to our kids has a meaning to them, right? Because the meaning to that kid was, there's something wrong with me. I mean, you're not passively saying that, you're actively saying that, right? So all of that needs to be undone in terms of helping the kid understand, if you have a attention deficit disorder, that is something you have, not something you are, right? But we very colloquially tell our kids a lot of stuff, right? And sometimes we do it jokingly, right? You know, you're retarded
Mm.
because you say something wrong. And I know that's not a word that nowadays can be used very much, but parents used to say that a lot.
Oh,
Well,
absolutely.
and kids say those things to others. No, you're acting retarded.
Yep.
We need to explain what we mean by that, right? So we have to be more careful with what we say by listening to what we're saying and to listening to the purpose of what we're saying. In this particular case, the motivation was purely helping the kid, right? The motivation is, I want my kid to get the best treatment and the best help to facilitate him or her being as adaptive as a human being as he can or she can be. The problem is that the process is delivering the wrong message, right? So even best intentioned parents can say things in a way that is not conducive to the kid developing solid self-esteem, right? Now, that sounds very technical, right? Because I'm a psychiatrist. That's what I do. I pay attention to those little details. And when I'm having a conversation with someone, probably my wife hates that. but but the reality is that I'm always thinking, what am I doing this for? What is she telling me this for? What is the purpose? What is the end? I'm always ahead trying to understand, because we're trying to problem solve, right? So a lot of what we do is unconscious. A lot of what we do is by example, right? And we've talked about this before. With in normal life, we have to show our kids our values. We have to show them, how we handle conflict. We have to show them how we handle rejection, how we handle criticism, right? How we can avoid violence. I mean, all of those things need to be shown, right? Now, if you have a rage problem, right, and you get in your car, and every time somebody cuts in front of you, you pull a gun. Well, the kid's learning, right, that that's how you handle your feeling that somebody took 3 seconds out of your life.
Mm.
You know, I mean, those things are not. Those things are senseless.
And those are the things that affect kids in the future. They see their relationships. They see two parents who are always fighting, constantly bickering. To them, that becomes normal, and that's a reflection of what they see as their example of a loving relationship.
And not only becomes normal, it is um, sometimes when I talk to parents, especially with kids who are very intense and the parents having a lot of difficulty, I explain to the parents, listen, I'm trying to help you understand that the purpose of all the stuff that we're doing here, this conversation we're having, is that your kid is not going to go in life dealing with authority figures the way they deal with you.
Mm.
Because if they do to a boss what they do to you, they're going to get fired, right? Hence, it's about them, right? So if you're engaging in these discussions, right, about who has more power, you or the child, well, those are the engagements he's going to have as an adult, right? So if you can teach what a good boss is supposed to be like, you know, that is able to listen and process, not necessarily agree with you, and is able to understand and guide you into how to do your job better, then he's going to search for bosses like that, right? Again, it's about the kid. It's not about us. But I mean, as we said last week, the only tools we have is what we learn with our own parents, right? So sometimes I think that there should be more training for, per, let's say, call it parenting training, right? Not only in the sense of doing the right things, but in the sense of not being afraid. I mean, I see a lot of young couples and I treat a lot of pregnant women that have problems with depression and anxiety and so on. And I'm seeing a lot of more fear, As I'm seeing young people being much more negative about the future,
Mm.
less hopeful. And I think that we need to reground our young people, into this stuff that you are afraid of that you're dealing with now. We all deal with it, but maybe we deal with it in a more adaptive way, not being so afraid of the world, right? Because fear of the world and fear of life and fear of uncertainty becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we need to help people not be so afraid, you know, be okay with not being totally in control,
Mm.
be okay with not knowing. That's the ultimate goal, right? Because the purpose of life, as we said, besides passing information biologically, psychologically, socially, I guess you can say we can add to have some contentment, right? Be content, not necessarily be static or happy. But let's be content.
Yeah, happy's the cherry on top. We've talked about that
Exactly.
before.
But content is okay. I'm good with the good and the bad. And I can navigate these waters, and I can lead my tribe, whatever the size of your tribe is. It can be one person, you know, into these waters and navigate life in an adaptive way to continue passing the information.
It's a lot about leadership, then, isn't it?
Yes, it's a lot about adaptive leadership, and it's a lot about. I mean, I keep going back to this because leadership is about it's the same as parenting. It's about assertive empathy, right? That you're not enabling, but you're setting boundaries, okay? And you have to sell your ability to lead to those who you want to follow, right? And there's basically a couple of ways of doing that. One is the authoritarian way, which is exercise a lot. You do as I told you because I'm your father and you have to respect me or else, right? That's one way. The other one is the empathic assertiveness way, I know more than you do, and I have experiences you don't have, and I want to facilitate you having those experiences, and I'll guide you to that process, and I'll be your safety net when things get too tough. Okay. Uh, and I'm not comparing authoritarianism with democracy. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is power versus assertive empathy, right? And you can, I mean, we've had more than one boss, in our lifetime. So we've seen them both, right? But with the problem with the authoritarian power based approach is that it's terribly empty.
Mm.
It teaches you nothing but fear. And sometimes it leads to hate, right? And it's fascinating because this is going to sound kind of paradoxical again. You can only hate people that you care for, right? It's difficult to hate somebody you have had an attachment to because hate is at the root of narcissistic injury. And to be narcissistically injured, you have to have care for someone, right?
Versus
So
indifference, which is just,
indifference, right?
yeah.
Or grief, it hurts me that you don't want to be with me, but that's okay. I can live with that. Versus you left me and I feel that this is the end of my life. I'm nobody without you. That's the traditional narcissistic injury type of situation. And this maybe we'll do a program about narcissistic injury one of these days, but that's the most destructive emotion in humanity,
Hmm.
right? Because it leads to passionate killing.
So, I mean, to close up, you talked about parents and training, and there should probably be some way for parents to get that additional information and training. Is there something like that in existence right now? Is there some place a person listening to this can go to say, you know what, I understand what you're saying. I think I need some more information, some more training, some more education. Or where would somebody find that?
It's really fascinating because there's a lot of parental training programs, but it's mostly for kids who are in trouble,
Hmm.
right? So you try to fix things, but there's very little preventiveness and very little proactiveness in terms of teaching kids and young adults how to be parents, right? I think that there needs to be a movement to help kids with parenting skills before they become parents. I think it should be like an elective in high school to start with, like in the senior class, you know, that they get some parenting classes. Uh, and for young adults, there's a lot of preparation that happens, like when you're gonna get married in the church, right? In different churches, they give you all kinds of training. Very little on parenting, though.
Hmm. More
Okay.
spiritually oriented.
Exactly. So, and I'm not talking down the spiritual importance and the need for people to follow their values and their culture. But in that context, there are practical things, right? Where you have to allow yourself some flexibility. Um, so maybe we'll start something like that. Maybe that's an idea. Maybe I'm planting a seed. Uh,
Or maybe I just did.
maybe you just did like if I don't have enough to do, it's like or maybe we can train some people to do things like that. But I think it's something that um, raising healthy, emotional, balanced kids is one of the best contributions we can make to the world. Okay, kids that need little, right, and want a lot, but they don't feel a slave by their emotional needs, and they can balance them. And that's for another conversation where we will talk about why you shouldn't be as ever slave by need, right? So let's talk about marriage and this. So we'll get to that. Okay.
Excellent. Well,
Hey,
once again, thanks for giving us your information and your knowledge, passing on the things you say we need to do. For yous out there who are listening, please do like, subscribe, share, and follow us both on Facebook and I believe TikTok as well now. Is that
yes,
correct?
and yeah, we're going to Spotify too now, so that's going to be moving forward. So thank you very much, guys. We'll see you next week.
Until next week, take care, Doctor.
Thanks. Okay, we're done.